it's a quick thing. I want to talk about your gussets.
Gusset.
Two things. Catherine had a couple of interesting things happen when she was installing her gusset that I want to make sure that we discuss. Ultimately she did a beautiful job. She did have some moments where there were some little tiny holes because of where she started and stopped the stitching. So she did a really good job of getting in there and going, oh, I've got a little tiny hole there, so I need to get back in and do a couple more stitches. She asked, if it's only a single stitch, can I do it by hand? The answer, unfortunately, is no, because we need the machine sewing to be consistent all the way across. One of the things that was interesting about Catherine's first attempt was she got the gusset in beautifully. She didn't follow the lines very well. So then she ended up having to take it out and do it a second time following the lines. So that's probably going to happen if you haven't gotten there yet. Just be prepared for that. But the last thing that's the most important thing I think here is pressing. Here's the inseam on her sleeve. Here's her side seam. You know this seam allowance has been pressed open, correct? As has this. What do you do with all of these seam allowances? The first thing you're going to do is you're going to press them all open. The biggest problem that creates is this seam allowance is great because it all continues to lay in that direction. This seam allowance is great because it all continues to lay in this direction. But what happens to the seam allowance on those two edges? They start doing this and falling back on top of one another when you've got it pressed to open. And so you end up with giant chunks, wads of junk right through here. So you're actually going to press it twice. The first thing you're going to do is press it open, and then the second thing you're going to do is press it like a dart with all of the seam allowance going this way. So it doesn't change the way that any of this seam allowance is going, but it does mean that then the gusset essentially on the interior, because you can see here she's got the problem where it started to roll back on itself like that. So ultimately it wants to look like this on the inside, completely open like that. Okay?
Oh.
But the first step is to press them open.
The first step is to press them all open like
and
that.
then repress it.
And then press it.
Out.
This step has to be done from the wrong side, and this step has to be done from the right side.
Okay. And so you flip it over?
Yeah, so you turn the whole thing right side out and use your sleeve board to be able to do the second set of pressing.
And you just kind of all press it down?
Yeah.
And what is the reason for having to do it from the right side on the second one?
If you do it from the wrong side, you can't feel/see that you've actually got a good clean press on the line.
Oh.
Much like a dart, you want to press it from the right side so you can use the edge of the iron to push everything in the appropriate direction.
I gotcha.
I have a question about the collar, or two. Do we overlock it?
No overlocking necessary.
Okay.
Why? Good question.
Because you won't have any raw edges.
Exactly, because all the raw edges are going to end up on the inside.
And the second one was the way we sew it. Are we going to do it like the gusset, where we do one line and then stop up and redo another line?
When you go to stitch the collar on,
When you stitch the
Together.
kind of the person.
it'll be three when you do the bag. It'll be one line of continuous sewing. So it's
Okay.
up, pivot the corner, go across, pivot the corner, and down.
Okay.
Have we ever discussed how to pivot a corner to make sure you've got a corner? Do you know what I'm talking about? Do you know what I'm talking about?
I know what you're talking about, but we haven't discussed the technique.
So you run the risk, if you're trying to sew a corner, you want your corner to look like this, right? Stitch, 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 stitch. Because your pattern has a corner, you want a corner on your sewing as well. But sometimes when you go to sew, it actually ends up doing that.
Right.
You've seen that happen before. Why does that happen? Why that happens is because you've sewed up until this point, and you can see that the needle has gone down through the hole there, but the stitch underneath hasn't been finished. And so you pivot, you lift up your foot, you pivot your fabric, put your foot down and keep going, and it actually finishes the stitch over here in this next position. So what you have to do when you get to this point, you have to turn the wheel to make sure that you see the needle go completely down and start to come back up and come about halfway back up, because that's when the top thread has been grabbed underneath. So if you don't actually see the needle go down and then start to come back up, that needle, that thread hasn't been caught, and you're gonna get this.
It should still be in the fabric, right?
It still needs to be penetrating the fabric, but it needs to have gone all the way down and start to come back up to be able to then lift and pivot.
And when you get close, maybe stop, back up on the foot pedal, and then do the last 2 or 3 stitches by the flywheel by hand, so that you're getting right on that corner.
On that
and
exact
not
point.
A little shy or a little past. Because sometimes it's almost a half a stitch. So you can,
Right.
And especially with this fabric with such large fibers, it could definitely end up that way. Like, is it on this side of the thread or that side of the thread? All right. We talked a lot today, I apologize.
That was good. A lot of
Ready,
really good
set,
stuff.
go!